Yeah, Kathryn, first of all, this topic, I have to tell you, has been on the radar at Rebel Book Club for years. And we've been too scared, I think, to really take it on, even though we have the word rebel there. We've been too scared. And I think partly because a lot of the time we're very much a community of people who are focused on positive development in our lives, whether that's in our workplace, in our health, in helping other people. And so, of course, the idea of discussing death and dying and the end of life is something that's instinctively you think, oh, no, that's not where we want to go. Having said this, we knew this was a topic we couldn't avoid forever. And I'm so glad that enough of our members said, come on, let's do it. And this month we have. So about 1,000 of us have been reading your book. Yeah, around the world. And there's been hopefully there's been a little bit of a surge on your sales. And then lots of people have been commenting and sharing conversations during the month. And as we know, this affects all of us. So I guess the starting point for me really is to ask you what's happened as a result of this piece of hard work that's you put together with the end in mind. What's happened since you've published this book to you in your life?
Oh, it's become a completely unexpected journey. I thought that it would be in some libraries and I would have got the desire to explain about ordinary dying kind of out of me and into a safe place so that I could retire and it would be out there. But as some of you may know, it became a bestseller, which shocked me. It was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize, which of course boosted its traction in a lot of places. It's out now, I think, in 17 languages. It's just amazed me. So I've been interviewed on radio and TV in the UK when there are dying things going on. BBC somehow got my phone number, and I keep having to remind them that I'm their girl. I can talk to them about dying, but they keep coming to me about grief, which I think is a whole other very specialist area.
Yes.
And I want to tread into places that are really not my expertise. But in fact, one of the things that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years is the number of people who have written to me about their bereavements because their bereavement has been changed by reading with the end in mind and understanding better what actually happened to the person they loved while they were sitting with them. So I think I've got a lot more deep and broad understanding about grief and bereavement now as a consequence of people's generosity with their stories. So lots of travel, lots of podcasts, lots of articles in newspapers and magazines. It's keeping me very busy.
Well, it's wonderful the impact that you've been able to have through this book and beyond. And I wanted, as you mentioned there, Kathryn, you've traveled a lot and you've spoken. You know, this sort of mission to open up the conversation around an engaged conversation here in the UK because of the fact that traditionally, as a culture, we're not good at being open and talking about death. But have you been surprised to see that elsewhere in the world, or has it been received differently in different cultures?
Well, I was a little bit surprised by some of the places that wanted to contract to translate it. So there's Portuguese translation, for example, which isn't from Portugal, but which is from Brazil. And I wasn't sure that the kind of British context and NHS medicine would really translate. But of course, most of the stories, even though they might be in a hospital setting, some of them, they're about people, aren't they? They're about families, they're about love and what really matters. So I guess it goes anywhere and people will identify with the stories that remind them of themselves. That's always what happens. The other thing is that I've discovered that, we believe that we're not very good at talking about this, that nobody wants to talk about it. Let's not be the first person to mention dying. And then when you are the first person to mention dying, suddenly people are queuing up to join in the conversation. So I'm glad that you were brave, because I think that what you found out is that there's a lot of curiosity and it's really hard to know what information that's out in the public domain is reliable, how much of it is just opinion, or that there's a lot of writing that's about a certain person's illness and a certain person's end of life care and a certain person's bereavement afterwards, which is, of course, completely valid first-hand evidence. But I'm writing not about a certain person, but about somewhere between 10 and 15,000 dying people that I've looked after. So I'm not writing about my dad or my friend. I'm trying to create stories that exhibit what happens in the round, really.
And each of these stories, what you seem and your colleagues seem to be so remarkable at is this ability to, for the people going through this process, it's that one of the most important, or if not the most important experience in their life. It's right up there. But as you just said, up to 15,000 people, that's a lot. So how have you maintained or developed your skill yourself and your colleagues to keep that level of utter focus on those individuals as humans and your professionalism? Like, what is it? Is it take a huge amount of energy, or does it become an instinctive set of skills that you develop over time?
That's a really good question, and I suspect it's a little bit of both, because even when it's the 10,000th time for a doctor or a nurse who's been around the block, a lot of times it's still the first time for this person. And I think very often I would feel energized by trying to do what's best for this person. I don't always recognize it as a repeat procedure. So being able to describe the process of dying, what to expect for a person who's frightened of it, and to narrate it to the very last breath amazes them. And at the end of it, there's a kind of pause. It's almost the same every single time. And then the person says, I need you to tell my family that. I need my people to know this. This is not what we were expecting. And because it's the first time they've heard it, it's the first time anybody's explained it to them, it's important and it's poignant. And I don't know how many thousands of times I've probably had that conversation, but I don't think I ever got through it without a lump in my throat or without tears in my eyes, because it matters so much to this person and this family to understand it. So I think we probably are re-energized by the people that we work with. And of course, although we're working with something that's sad, because farewells are sad, palliative care is not only about dying. In fact, palliative care isn't really about dying at all. It's about getting living right. It's about sorting out symptoms. It's about navigating through some of the psychological distress. It's about helping people to work out what to do with what would once have been religious spiritual values, and they're trying to find a way to navigate existential stress if they don't have religion, or to find appropriate spiritual support if they do have religion. And the best way of getting rid of the symptoms of an illness, of course, is to cure the illness. So that's why we meet people where cure isn't an option, or the cure won't be soon. We meet a lot of people who will be cured, but the burden of their treatment is so terrible that we're palliating their symptoms to help them to bear it, to get to cure. So if there's one thing for Rebel Book Club to take home, it's that you're not obliged to die just because you've met the palliative care team. We don't mind if you survive.
When you give that amazing word, some great examples, and I'm thinking of the couple especially who didn't know that the other person knew that he was dying, and you were able to tell the story, and that storytelling skill and the narration, as you said, to the last breath is something that's really stood out to me. It's like, oh wow, this is almost an art form, of a storytelling art form, and that's remarkable. I wanted to invite, partly because my internet's a little unstable, a couple of friends to join our little conversation here. So I don't know if Kira, you're here, Kira Moser, who's actually going to co-lead our event in London tomorrow.
I'm here.
Hi, Kira. Do you want to switch on and let me add you to the stage here? I can't quite see you down below, and there's all these lovely people. Oh, there you are. So let me add you up here, and also Ryan, are you here? Kira, welcome.
Super to be here.
Hello, Kira.
So welcome. And maybe Kira, you can introduce yourself. Yes, Kira, maybe you can introduce yourself to Rebel Book Club and to Kathryn.
Well, hello Rebel Book Club, and hello Kathryn Mannix. What a treat for me to meet you. I come from a nursing background, cardiology, which is some of the stories that you talked about. So actually, for reading the book for me, it was a lovely journey back to sort of the care that I looked after patients some years ago. I left cardiology and moved into palliative care because I thought there was a sort of a need to bring non-cancer knowledge to the hospice where I live here, and I moved into palliative care education, which is where I fell in love with palliative care and what they do. And I think that palliative care has so much to offer, not just people who are dying and families who are living on, but also actually I think the wider world has a lot to learn from palliative care as well. And yeah, I just relished my years there, and it was a lovely journey back. So through the book, so thank you very much. Since then, I've moved more into behavioural science and decision making, and now I'm working on some digital solutions to deal with anticipatory planning and powers of attorney, and trying to do what we can to get things right, parking the sort of the emotional stuff a little bit, and trying to do the practical stuff. So trying to help people through the practical things. So that's me.
Wow.
Thanks, Kira. And I also wanted Kathryn and Rebel Book Club to invite Ryan. Good to see you, Ryan. Can you see and hear us?
Hello, can you hear me, Rebel Book Club?
Yes, yeah, welcome, Ryan. So just for Rebel Book Clubbers and for Kathryn, Ryan has been a long-term member. In fact, has been our dream Rebel Book Club member, because he's given us so many nudges about books and reviews over the years. And he's also a co-host of Rebel Book Club Manchester, which is meeting tomorrow. But Ryan's life changed dramatically last year, and Ryan came forward and asked if he could share a little bit. And I wonder, Ryan, if you can also, as well as share a bit about your story and connect back to what you've learned from reading Kathryn's book, and of course any conversation and questions you'd like to have. Over to you, Ryan.
Can you still see me? Because I've lost everything.
I can see and hear you.
Okay. So hi Rebel Book Club. So in sort of October last year, I was given a cancer diagnosis. It was a sarcoma diagnosis, so it's currently still ongoing, sort of as we speak. And from there, it's been sort of a journey, basically. With the palliative care team, they've been heavily involved with myself because, unfortunately for me, I've had quite a bit of issues with pain. So that's the one thing that I've learned, and the one thing that I've sort of come to understand through all this journey is the support that they can provide, amongst everything else. But the palliative care team have been amazing in terms of helping me be comfortable, in my day to day, which is the most important thing. So reading sort of the book, that's sort of what I've taken from it the most. So I can sort of relate to it essentially, basically, is that help and assistance that they're there, and that calming and understanding that they provide. Because they've currently got me to a place where I'm home. I'm currently in my own house. I'm currently sort of on the right level of pain relief that I need. And I'm sort of able to enjoy the day to day. That's currently where I'm at. Can everyone still hear and see me? Because I've got a
we can, Ryan. We're hearing, seeing it, and you're amazing at. I know you messaged me and everyone else is that I'm reading this book, I'm doing this thing. I'm like, hang on a second, Ryan's mid chemo at the moment. How is he doing all this? So I wonder if you have any, as we're here together, any questions for Kathryn?
I don't. Honestly, my head is sort of scrambled at the moment. You mentioned chemotherapy, and I'm back there tomorrow. So I'm having a bit of a fuzzy day today, to be honest. Apologies for not having anything prepared.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
I'm just delighted. that you hear, that you've read it, and chemo brain is definitely a thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
absolutely get that. Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Excellent. Also, that you describe being comfortable, because
yes.
I think that's really important, that what we're trying to do is help people to be able to live comfortably through their day, doing the things that matter to them.
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of us, including people who are on this call now, who might not do that in 100% comfort, even when we haven't got a serious illness. So it's great if we can get rid of everybody's pain, but sometimes there's a bit left. But what we're working for is that exactly what you're describing. I'm able to embrace the day and do what matters most. And I'm really glad that's
definitely.
where you've got to.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Thanks, Kathryn. I wonder if I could ask you, Kathryn, about helping families. We all have our families. Begin conversations around end of life, where maybe it hasn't come up yet, and perhaps it should have done because of where our different stages our families are. What's your sort of suggestion of how we begin this, especially in a kind of culture where it is a bit of taboo? I mean, of course, we can give them your book. That's a great start. But what else might we do?
It's a lot of words to get a family together for a conversation, isn't it? Although I have to say, about 3 years after the book came out, I got a message from a lady who said to me, this is going to be my last Christmas and she told me what her illness was. So I've bought your book for each of my adult daughters for Christmas. I thought, oh, poor things. But what she said was, I want them to read it after Christmas, and then we'll do my advanced care planning together once I know that everybody knows what we're going to be facing. And I thought that was really interesting, wasn't it? So what are the tricks for starting a conversation that everybody feels a little bit awkward about? One of the things that can go wrong is there's one person trying to steamroller everybody else into the conversation. And that gets people's backs up. It makes people feel anxious and nervous. If they're steamrollering us into the conversation, will they go off and say terrible and scary things once we start the conversation? So inviting rather than insisting is a really good way of doing this, of saying, listen, guys, I have a serious illness. I want to discuss the things that are important to me with all of you so that we're all on the same page together. And so if I'm having a really ropey day, somebody else can talk and I can just listen and nod or shake my head. So, I'd like you all to understand. Sometimes it's younger people trying to get that information out of their older relatives. And again, if we approach it by parenting our relatives, come on, Dad, if we just give you a really good talking to, we can sort it out. Why would you talk to somebody who's talking to you like that? Whereas if you use the relationship that you have with them, which is it's your aunt, it's your parent, it's your grandparent. So there's this thing, Mum, that I'm worrying about. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm worried about it. And sometimes it distracts me at work. And it's a kind of tricky thing to talk about. But I think that if I could talk to you about it for, just 10, 15 minutes, I might feel a lot better. And it's about your illness. And it's about if you were sick and the doctors asked me what you wanted, I just wouldn't know. They would think I would know because I'm your eldest daughter or whatever. Could you take a few minutes at some point where you feel okay to do it so we could just have that conversation? So now you're asking your parent to parent you, or you're asking your auntie to auntie you. And of course, we want to help each other. And if we're trying to navigate our way into the conversation in a not taking over kind of way, it makes it easier to get into it. And it also puts the ball back into the court of the person who should be controlling the conversation, who's the person whose end of life wishes you want to talk about. The other thing you can do when there's nobody sick, but we just know we need to talk about it, is there's a game that Americans are encouraged to play at Thanksgiving, which is that they all have to guess the favorite dinner or the favorite pizza topping or something like that of the person sitting to their left. And gathered around a family table will be the people who know each other best in the world, close family around a Thanksgiving table. They're hopeless at guessing each other's favourite meal or favourite pizza topping. And then the prompt card says, okay, so how are you going to discuss on behalf of somebody else what their preferences are if they're ever seriously sick? And then there are 3 key questions for people to ask each other over the table. And of course, what it does is it starts a conversation not about illness and death, but about well-being and what matters most to me. Because when we know what matters most to the people who we love, then if they're brought into hospital because they're really unwell, and I'm the doctor that rolls up to see them, I'm not asking the family whether I should do surgery or give them chemotherapy. That's a medical decision. I'm saying what matters most to this person, because if I can understand how they roll and what makes them tick, then what we can do is wrap the medical possibilities for care around their values and bring things in a direction that will best suit and least harm what matters most to them. So somebody's asking about if you don't have a family.
Yes.
I have a very, very dear friend who's had these conversations with me because she has no family. And I have another friend who actually is the person who represents the views of 3 elderly people who live in the road that he lives in, because they don't, well, one of them has family in a different part of Europe and 2 of them don't have family at all. So we might have to be creative about it, but we can appoint people with lasting powers of attorney who can be our representatives. And what a lot of people don't realize, the laws are different around the world, but in the countries and kingdoms of the United Kingdom, you can be married to somebody for 60 years. If you lose consciousness and you haven't filled in and registered the forms that give that person lasting power of attorney, they have no permission in law to speak on your behalf. So there is a website for it. You can Google it. It isn't cheap, but if anybody's in receipt of benefits, it's half the price. And for some people, it's completely free. It takes probably half an hour to fill in a form, but it takes days or weeks to have the conversations with the people who matter to you so that they know what to say if they're called on. And you can appoint one person or you can appoint a bunch of people, and you tell them what it is that you would want or what matters most to you. So then if the hospital or your doctor at home is proposing treatment that they know you wouldn't want, then just in the same way as we all have the right to refuse a treatment, even if the doctor thinks it would be best for us, but we can't demand a treatment that the doctor doesn't think is going to help us, our person with powers of attorney can turn things down on our behalf, can protect us from intrusions that we don't want.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for picking up on that. Lots of comments and questions coming in, mainly around how much they've appreciated how much the book has helped them. But Elle also asked, we covered the question earlier about what surprised us about the book, so we have to rewatch that, Elle. But stories or themes in the book you feel readers misinterpret or overlook? Is there something that you hoped would come through stronger and it hasn't quite happened? Or
so I had an interesting misinterpretation of the story about Holly, who was the girl I went out to visit on a Saturday, and she was in her flat and she was playing her music and tossing her ponytail around and couldn't sit still. And she was somebody who was in kidney failure. So, we're talking about, well, Kira was saying how important it is that we don't just limit palliative care to cancer diagnoses. There are lots of things that can make people feel unwell, and palliative care is relevant to all of those things. So she had kidney failure. And kidney failure makes people very nauseous. So her kidney doctors had made a suggestion to her GP about a treatment for the nausea. And on the same day that she started that treatment, her nausea went away completely, but she hadn't slept since then. She'd been constantly on the go, couldn't sit down, sat down, stood up, wobbling around the house. It was using up the little bit of energy that she had left. And this is a side effect of certain medications that includes this drug she'd been given for nausea. And I knew that she was going to exhaust herself if I couldn't switch that hyperactivity side effect off. And I had to go back to my hospice to get the medication that I needed to give her. The problem was that when eventually we gave her that medication, the false energy that she'd had then was taken away. And it turned out that she was, in fact, very, very close to dying. And because we've been able to take that kind of agitated energy away from her, she was too weak even to get up the stairs. So we made her a camp bed on the floor of her living room in her apartment, and her daughters cuddled up to her, and she gradually lost consciousness and died within about 2 or 3 hours of having given that injection. And I was still in the house. Most people have understood that she died because she was dying, and she died more comfortably because that agitated hyperactivity was taken away. But a few people have asked me whether the police were informed that I performed a euthanasia without permission. So they've misunderstood that the injection killed her rather than the injection settled the side effects of the treatment that she'd been having. So would I have written that a different way? Maybe I would have edited it more carefully if one of my first readers had picked up that suggestion. But mainly, no, the feedback that I get from people is mainly about what you're describing is what I saw when my husband, mum, auntie, puppy, guinea pig died, because this is the way animals die, right? And people come up to me at book events and they whisper it. They're kind of looking around to make sure nobody else can hear, and they're saying, so when my mum died, it was really peaceful and we were all there and it was so gentle. You know, it feels a bit weird, but I would almost say it was beautiful. And it was just that gentle breathing that you described. And then they say, but we never tell anybody because we know that dying is usually terrible and we don't want to make other people feel sad or jealous that we had such a lovely experience. And I say, no, actually what you had was a lovely experience for you, and I'm glad. But actually it was a very, very usual experience. I've started using the expression ordinary dying. What you saw was ordinary dying. Please go and tell people, because there are sometimes uncomfortable deaths, just as there are sometimes plane journeys that end tragically. And those are the things that get into the newspapers.
Yes.
So if you only knew about air travel, what you read in the newspapers, you would never get on a plane. But because you realize that the tragedy of plane travel going wrong is a tiny, tiny slice of an absolutely enormous pie, we have that in proportion. But when we hear some stories about difficult dying, which may have been very difficult dying for that person and that family, often means palliative care wasn't involved early, often means that there were things going on that turned their discomfort, and Ryan might have something to say about this. There's the discomfort of physical symptoms, and then there is the suffering of the kind of emotional overlay of resenting the symptoms or being traumatized by the symptoms or being traumatized by your health being taken away. This isn't a criticism of people, it's just an observation of the way people interpret their illness. And so those difficult deaths get into the newspapers, and because nobody's got a reference point for ordinary dying, they assume that all dying is going to be difficult. And so they're frightened then for other people and for themselves.
Yeah, and that fear builds. Thank you, Kathryn. So many questions coming in now. As you do, is we're kind of like squeezed for time. So I'm going to try and gather them up into little themes. So one is around if there's disagreement around end-of-life care, how have you seen that being approached and resolved? If there's very clear sort of like disagreement.
Between people in a family or between a patient and the medical advisors, or who's disagreeing?
I'm not sure. I'm assuming let's say between a family.
Well, families are families. Many of us belong to families. And a lot of the time they're a great blessing. And sometimes you could just run out screaming, couldn't you? So families do their family thing the way they do their family thing. And we all respond to stress in slightly different ways. So some people respond to stress by getting really active and wanting to do things and taking control and doing internet searches. And other people want to respond to stress by just not talking about it. Yeah. Other people want to respond to stress by just going for long walks in nature, So when they come back, the people who've been doing the bed changes or whatever, all the hard work, think you've just been out for a lovely time. They haven't really interpreted that this person's getting their head together by going out for a long walk in nature. So one of the things about family disagreements is to help people to sit down and say, okay, what's the thing that matters most to us all at the moment? And it's almost always that this person who we all love lives the very best way they possibly can for however much time is left. Okay, so we're all trying to do that, but we're all doing it in slightly different ways. Let's have a little think about how each person makes a contribution, but also how each person restores themselves, because some people are going to restore themselves by talking, and some people are going to restore themselves by being quiet, and some people are going to restore themselves by going for a run, and some people are going to restore themselves by reading a book about dying. Let's acknowledge that we're all different, but we're all facing the same direction and trying to do our best for this person.
Fantastic. And then we've got another group of questions. Lots of thank yous, by the way. And Ali's saying, I actually listened to the audiobook and found the narration so powerful and captivating. It felt like you were there, which is wonderful to hear. So there's a couple of questions coming in around society and how society is changing and the impact this has on how we think about dying. So two things being mentioned. One is the pandemic. I think Carly's is asking about, has that shifted anything in how we approach end of life? And then the second is around the assisted dying bill. So, which in the UK is this big political debate, but it's a process that we're in now. What's your sense of those two shifts on the impact of this topic?
So COVID first and the pandemic. So that was really hard, wasn't it? And everybody who's with us now will have had a slightly different experience of that. I kind of had high hopes that even though it was terrible, it might peel off the lid of we don't talk about that stuff. And I think for a little while it did. But actually what happened was that the news turned it into data about deaths, numbers, and not stories about people, which is what helps us to understand what's going on. So I think eventually the way the reportage of the pandemic took place, it rather distanced us rather than brought us closer to talking about dying. And of course, also it wasn't so much ordinary dying, was it? It was extraordinary. People were taken away from their homes. They weren't able to see the people who they loved the most. People had no picture in their head of what the sick person was like in hospital because they weren't allowed to visit. So I think it was a very, very strange and very, very difficult time during which a great deal of misinformation was peddled on the internet, a lot of it mischievously, as a consequence of which doctors and nurses who were already absolutely exhausted by doing the job that they were doing, and I came out of retirement to go back to work during the pandemic, and my trust that I used to work for, I thought I was just going to come back and be a palliative care doctor, but they said actually what we want is to put you in staff support, because actually if you can help to train new doctors and nurses who aren't used to having conversations about dying and suddenly are faced with all of these deaths and all of these dying people and needing to make phone calls to people's families to bring them up to speed, to break unwelcome news, eventually to tell them that a person's died. So that was my job during COVID, was to build an unwelcome news breaking kit for people who hadn't done that before for the National Health Service, and then teach it in my own organisation.
Wow.
So I think COVID itself exhausted the staff in healthcare, not just nurses and doctors. Of course, we had, staff who would normally be in admin and clerical roles, manning phones, making phone calls, talking to people's families, medical students, the housekeepers and the porters. Everybody was in it together. It was an amazing togetherness. But then once you start to hear the public saying, oh, but all you're doing is dancing on TikTok, that is so heartbreaking when you're already exhausted. I think a lot of people were very, very demoralized by the end of the pandemic. So assisted dying. Assisted dying is a problem when you're trying to campaign to get people to talk about ordinary dying because it hijacks the conversation all the time. And that's happening again now. So people keep pressing me for, well, what do you think? Are you for it or are you against it? And my absolute down the line opinion is I'm neither. I've been looking at this up close and personal for 30 years, and it's way more complicated than the wording of the bill before our Parliament at the moment is even starting to acknowledge. The safeguarding issues are enormous. The compassion of the people who are trying to move Parliament forward into agreeing it is huge. The compassion of the people who are worried about the safeguarding issues is equally huge. There are no baddies here. There are just people trying to find a way through something that is incredibly complicated and trying to do it by a private members process, which is the particular way that the Parliament is doing it, means that it isn't going to have enough time for all of the nuances that really do need to be addressed if we're to have a really safe law that permits assisted dying for the people who want to be able to use it, but doesn't cause a sense of threat to the people who don't want to use it. So I'm very sad about the way we're doing it, and I haven't got an opinion about whether it's right or wrong in itself.
Thank you for sharing that, Kathryn. And I'm conscious of our time together. And Kira, can I bring you back in or have a think about what you might want to ask Kathryn and or Elaine? Oh, she's all here as well. So many fantastic people. When we break out into our chat rooms in a minute, you can hopefully bump into some other people who are working in this space. And there was one question here around, oh yes, Joe is asking, so you as you said, Kathryn, 30 years. Where is palliative care in the UK today? Where's it got to? What's the priority, I guess, of improving it going forward? And how does that, if I can add on, how does that compare to other places?
Oh, it's a good question, isn't it? So 30 years ago, I think we thought that within 10, 15 years, people working in working in hospices, which is what it was called when I went to work there. The expression palliative care hadn't been invented yet. That we would educate ourselves out of a job. We would give the knowledge about good symptom management into cancer services, long-term condition management, general practitioners, district nurses, and then we wouldn't be needed anymore and we could go off back into wherever we came from. So cancer management for me, but a lot of people, lots of different places. And of course, that doesn't happen because once you have a specialty and the specialty starts to be interested in particular things and it generates research, the body of knowledge gets bigger and bigger and bigger until in the end it's too big to add to a GP or a district nurse or a cardiologist or an oncologist to ask them to know all of that as well. So we've continued to grow as a specialty. When I was a trainee doctor, I was one of something like 20 trainee doctors in palliative medicine in the UK. There will now be hundreds of trainees. Every hospital in this country now has a specialist team of palliative care professionals, doctors, nurses, and other allied health professions. Hospices, there were 5 hospices in the UK when I started, and I don't know how many hundred there are now. There are fewer this year than there were last year because their funding is running out. And there is a real problem about funding for palliative care in this country. But the problem isn't just about the funding of specialists in palliative care, working in hospices or working in community advisory teams or working in hospital teams like I used to. We're the kind of tip of the pyramid, the experts who see the hardest patients, but who also offer consultation and advice to people who are experts in their own right in the next layer down. So I might do a consult in a cardiology ward, for example, and Kira, before she did her palliative care training, might have been the nurse who was looking after a patient in a cardiology ward. And I would do my evaluation and then I would make my suggestions to Kira and her colleagues and the doctors there. And then I wouldn't need to see the patient again. And the next time they had a patient with that kind of problem, they would implement that kind of intervention, so their learning gradually grows. But if what I'd suggested wasn't enough, then that person might need to be looked after all of the time by a specialist. So when we're funding palliative care, it's not just the small population of hospices and specialist nurses and doctors and other healthcare professionals. It's district nurses not having enough time to attend at somebody's house and really bottom out what's going here. It's GPs not being well enough staffed now that the same GP can see this patient every time they're needed to be seen and have time to go out and visit them at their home because the patient is no longer well enough to come in and be seen at the practice. So there's this huge pyramid of palliative care that needs to be funded, not just the little bit of money that the government announced last year to secure some hospice beds. Rant over.
Rant over. Good rant, Kathryn. And lots of other comments coming in, but Elaine, I wonder if you can also share a link to your work so those can click through to it, because we don't have time to chat tonight. Maybe we'll see you tomorrow in London. Elaine's written this great book called All the Ghosts in the Machine, which is about
Elaine Casket, it's lovely that you're here.
Well, let's get Elaine on quickly if you know each other. Come on then. Let's see if I can find her. Elaine, come up here.
Kathryn.
Where are you? You're hiding out somewhere, aren't you?
Yes, I'm hiding out writing at the moment. It's so lovely to see you, Kathryn. Really nice to see you. We've had a lot of mutual support over the years, so I'm really pleased to be here. And really quickly, in light of what you were just saying, in a recent piece of writing I was doing, I came across I was writing about employee surveillance. I came across a horrible article in the New York Times, an investigation talking about how these like timing things have been placed on hospice workers. And this, that worked for a big hospice organization in the US, sort of saying, okay, you have this many minutes to go see a dying patient. You have this many minutes to whatever. And they were basically having to meet targets. But death didn't obey the plan. Death didn't obey the calendar. And a lot of the people who work for this organization were leaving. They said, well, we can't do our job within these systems. And I thought, my gosh, even hospice in the United States is being subjected to these kinds of expectations. A really horrifying piece in the New York Times. And I was thinking about it when you were speaking just now about the resources and the systems and structures and how much that matters for the work that people in palliative care are able to do.
Yeah, absolutely right. And also because we've got an international audience, it's probably worth saying that the word hospice means something different in the USA from almost everywhere else in the world. So in the USA, hospice is a program. It's about the last 6 months of life. It often requires people to have stopped treatment for the condition that affects them, and then they're allowed into the hospice program funding. Whereas hospices are usually buildings or a care team that visits people for hospice at home in their own homes in the UK. And they are our specialist palliative care beds. They're not for the last 6 months of life. They're for the point at which you need a patient surrounded by specialist care to make a difference to their emotional symptoms, their physical symptoms, or perhaps it's a family that requires that level of support to hold everything together as the person is dying, but it's not the same meaning. So I worked in a hospice as a palliative care doctor, but I wasn't only seeing people who were in the last 6 months of their lives.
Thanks, Kathryn. And of course, we opened this conversation by saying we haven't been brave enough to tackle this topic, but we read Elaine's book for, 5 years ago now, I think, All the Ghosts in the Machine, which was about our digital, exploring the impact of death on our, in terms of our digital footprint and what happens to our lives online after we die, which was an amazing experience to go through that. And a great book. For those of you who've just joined, look at Elaine's great work and lots of writing since and more now. Kira, can I bring you back in? Just a reflection or a question for as we wrap up the conversation.
I would like to ask Kathryn 2 mini questions. What is one thing that we could do for ourselves tomorrow that would make talking about death better? And what is a question we could ask somebody that we love? One simple, easy thing to do.
I think the question to ask a person that we love is, what are the things that matter most to you? Because that's a joyful conversation. It's about relationships and it's about the things that give our lives meaning. So I think that's a really great place. And actually, I'm going to tell you the things that matter to me as well, so that we share it and we have that conversation together. So maybe that's also the one thing. But I think the other one thing that we could do is to find a reference piece of information that's reliable about what the process of dying is actually like. So I've just a couple of videos on my website that are only 3 minutes, because most people are not going to read 30 stories where the person dies at the end of every single story. I'm sorry, people.
A lot of people have.
I did. Actually, I think Dan wasn't dead, was he, by the end of the story? But most other people were. So a 3 minute something from a reliable source. So there are some really good TED Talks also about dying. Mine is on there, but other stories are available. And I think it's really important that the more we know, the less dark spaces of not knowing that we fill with all our imaginary terrors. So I think it's the more we know, the calmer we can feel. And the lovely feedback that I've had from the book has not just been from bereaved people, but from people who said, you know what, I was sitting with my person and I noticed those changes that you talked about. Or the nurses said, oh, you've been here for days and your mum looks pretty much the same today. Why don't you go home, have a shower, have a good night's sleep, come back tomorrow, bring your slippers and your knitting with you, to pass the time. And we got up to leave and I said to my sister, hang on, mum's breathing's changing. And if we'd left then, we wouldn't even have got halfway home before she had died. So that knowledge is power, isn't it? It gives us choices and it gives us insights. And also just the understanding that those weird breathing noises, and they are weird breathing noises. And when it's your person, they sound even weirder. So I've been hearing them for years before I sat by my nana dying and heard her doing those noises. And half of my head is saying, this is deep, unconscious breathing. Thank goodness she's so comfortable. And the other half of me is trying to work out, is she trying to say something? Is she uncomfortable? Is she groaning? Now, I knew the answer and I was still distressed by it. So we really have to be better at understanding it, because then when we understand it, we can also explain it to the other people who are around the bed with us. So we're all experiencing what's actually happening and not what we think is happening that traumatizes us.
Great questions, Kira, and thank you, Kathryn. I can imagine the billboard which says the more we know about dying, the calmer the life we can have. And just what an amazing message to help people become engaged with this vital topic. Ryan, I want to give you a chance, just as before we go into our breakout rooms, a reflection or a thought, and also perhaps to get you to share your amazing Instagram, because Ryan has an Instagram which talks about non-fiction more than Rebel Book Club. So put that in the chat, because there's some people here who would like to follow you, your Rebel Book Club, your book club reviews. Any quick thoughts after listening this evening, Ryan?
Yeah, you're too kind, firstly, about my general ramblings on books. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you, Kathryn, and just wanted to say, something you touched on is something that's so I think is so important, is having that sort of familiarity. You touched on, people who haven't seen the same doctors, seen the same nurses, that type of thing, and without having that, it's really, I'm struggling to get my words out, but it's so vital to have that familiarity, especially when you're going through something, with whether it's like pain or death or something like that. To have that familiarity of a nurse or a doctor, just, I can't stress how important it is.
Yeah.
And when the palliative care team first introduced themselves to me, I had no idea sort of, what they were providing. I just, it was a bit of a shock, and a bit of a shock that they came to me as well. But it was so important that they did, and the journey that we went on together, and the journey that we're continuing to go on. Now, fortunately, I'm lucky that I've been able to get back home, but they're still, they still come to visit my house, and they're still here, and they're still able to support me, and it's a positive thing when I see them. They've turned it into such a positive impact in my life, and that's all I can say. I'm just so thankful for people like yourself, and and for the service that we have in this country. It's truly is amazing, and it has been for me, and countless people who are going through really, really difficult journeys. So yeah, that's currently where I'm at. I've got my chemotherapy tomorrow, so I'm getting my strong face on, and it's going to be good and positive, and yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah, good luck tomorrow, and thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. Thanks,
Thank
Ryan.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, and lots of love from everyone at Rebel Book Club. There's his Instagram.
Oh,
You can give honest reviews of his reviews. Kira, we'll see you tomorrow in London. Elaine, we might see you if you return from your writing retreat. Kathryn, huge thank you for obviously all your work and your writing, which has had a massive impact on our little community, and we'll go on talking about it at 8 events tomorrow. So well beyond the conversation tonight. So thank you. And Rebel Book Club,